Hello and welcome to DawnNews English. I'm Nadia Naqi with you for 20 minutes. And on this 20 minutes, we have to discuss something which is very, very important and needs much attention. Whatever is happening in Afghanistan, the Taliban regime seems to break promises. Their posture is entirely different from what they had promised the world of being all inclusive, and then all the kind of bans that they've put on women participation in all spheres of life, on education, on women working in NGOs, in the cabinet, and even otherwise, the humanitarian crisis that Afghanistan faces, the economic challenges that are just looming in Afghanistan, and on top of it, the terrorism that is just increasing. We're going to be discussing this, asking Michael Kugelman, who is a senior fellow at the South Asia Institute director at the Wilson Center, as if the Taliban are using this as leverage to draw the world attention. Or is it that, the international community must engage with the Taliban regime in order to pressurize them for a better Afghanistan? And of course, we can't forget Pakistan, because Pakistan is, the bordering country, the neighbor. We can't change our neighbors, and what recently have been taking place, the resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan. Most of it have been claimed by TTP across the border. They have been residing there. And one of the problems that Pakistan thought after the Taliban took over would be that this matter would be resolved once and for all. It doesn't seem happening that way. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael, today on 20 Minutes. Have you or did you expect this to happen? When the Taliban took over and the way they were posturing that they are a different set of regime, they're not the 90s Taliban, they're going to be all inclusive. And just 1 year down the line, we see exactly what one could expect the Taliban to be like.
Yeah, well, I and many others were skeptical when the Taliban had made those claims that they would be a different Taliban from the late 90s Taliban. It was clear that the Taliban had changed in several, I would argue, superficial ways. One is that they had learned to embrace the power of social media. They learned that PR can be very important, the idea of trying to convince the outside world that they were different. And that entailed having a number of token arrangements, such as bringing some religious minorities into a room to meet with some Taliban leaders and things like that. So they understand PR now in ways that they didn't in the late 1990s. But no, this is the same Taliban at the end of the day. It's an ideological organization at its core, and it wants to impose that incredibly dangerous, damaging, misogynistic, among other things, ideology in Afghanistan. And it did take some time. Some have wondered why the Taliban didn't start imposing these restrictions just in the first few weeks or months after they took over. But they've done it, and unfortunately, it's not a surprise. And I think that those that thought that the Taliban would be a so-called Taliban 2.0, a bit naive, perhaps a bit too optimistic, given the Taliban's very unfortunate track record.
So in all of this, of course, the track record that you're just speaking about and the actions that are taking place within Afghanistan by the Taliban regime are, for me, they are not surprising. And as you said, for many others, maybe they're not surprising because they were all skeptical. Having said that, what about the dreaded terror that is coming back within Afghanistan, which the Taliban are unable to actually control, especially IS getting stronger and that emanating from Afghanistan? Do you not feel the US, which finds IS as the main threat, this could probably lead to some kind of global terrorism, something that the US tried to defeat after 9/11?
Right. It's sadly ironic that one of the last days that the U.S. had a military presence in Afghanistan, that there was this terrible Islamic State attack that killed dozens of people, including some American soldiers. And of course, Islamic State is a terror group that did not exist when U.S. forces first entered Afghanistan. That was focused on eliminating Al-Qaeda. So indeed, this is the chief U.S. concern about Afghanistan post-withdrawal, that you could have a country that once again becomes a sanctuary for the types of terror groups that threaten and target the United States and other countries far beyond Afghanistan. But I don't think we're there yet. And unfortunately, I think it's the likes of Pakistan and other neighbors of Afghanistan that will be most in danger at this point. The terror groups in Afghanistan, and particularly, specifically Islamic State Khorasan, they pose a threat within Afghanistan, but they also pose a threat to Pakistan. Islamic State Khorasan just this past year carried out several missile attacks against a few Central Asian countries. So I think that's the main concern now. I think that we have to look for in the next year, which would give us an indication that Islamic State could pose a broader global threat beyond the region, is to start to see indications of foreign fighters from Europe and elsewhere around the world coming into to Afghanistan to work with Islamic State Khorasan, same folks that may have fought with Islamic State in the Middle East. I mean, these would be the types of folks that would have the know-how and the capacities and other abilities to work on plotting and mounting attacks far beyond Afghanistan. But obviously, that's no consolation. Pakistan, I think, Pakistan is very concerned about TTP, as it should be, but Islamic State Khorasan is very much a threat to Pakistan as well.
So do you see that happening, or do you think there is a need? As of now, you said, it's more threatening for Pakistan and probably for the region. The IS getting stronger in Afghanistan. But ultimately, do you see that US will have to cooperate with Taliban in order to, deal with IS? I
don't think it was ever a serious possibility that the U.S. would view the Taliban as a counterterrorism partner. A shared enemy is not enough, right? I mean, obviously the record of the Taliban, and I think for the U.S., even before seeing what the Taliban has done over the last few months with its social policies, I think there was just a lot of sort of an ickiness factor, so to speak, in Washington. The idea of working with the likes of the Haqqani network, which Haqqani network leaders are now in charge of security issues in Afghanistan. The idea of working with the Haqqani network to try to counter Islamic State, it wasn't going to fly. But I think now, given what the Taliban has done with its bans on higher education for women, it's possible for the U.S. to contemplate working with the Taliban on the issue of Islamic State.
But is this really working, Michael, that everybody is disengaging with the Taliban? There has to be some kind of engagement with the Taliban regime in order to pressurize them, whether it is for women participation, whether it is to deal with, rising terrorism there. How can the international community then deal with this? There's nobody left, there's no pressure that you can create unless and until you engage with them.
Right, and there's a very rigorous debate, policy debate that's been ongoing for quite some time, certainly in the West in particular, about what engagement should look like and how it can work. I mean, you probably know just recently a senior UN official called for the West, for Western countries to reopen their embassies in Afghanistan because that would put them in a better position to get a sense of what's going on the ground. That's one perspective. But I think that there's several points here. One is that we've seen that engagement hasn't worked. I mean, ever since the Taliban took over, the U.S. and other Western countries, and many countries in the region as well, of course, have tried to engage dialogue with the Taliban to try to get them to moderate their policies. And there's still some now that would argue that the idea of aid can be used as a point of leverage. And with this new ban on women working with NGOs, there's some that have said, well, maybe if these NGOs shut down their operations, and some have, that would make the Taliban realize that this country could experience mass starvation if the Taliban doesn't start changing these policies. But my response to that, and this gets into some of the internal dynamics of the Taliban, do the people in the Taliban that are actually calling the shots, those that make the policies, the emir in Kandahar and his aides, do they actually care about this type of thing? I mean, would they actually be susceptible to these ideas that, oh well, if you moderate your policies, we'll help ensure that your country doesn't starve? At the end of the day, does the top leadership care about the plight of the mass public in Afghanistan? I think that some Taliban leaders do, but those that are calling the shots, the most hardline ideological elements, I'm not sure if they would be receptive to that type of argument, which is a very troubling thing to contemplate. But that could be a possibility as well. That gets into bigger issues about who really calls the shots within the Taliban, and we know that at this point, it's Akhundzada, the supreme leader. There have been some more relatively, I use the term, ironically, more moderate, less hardline leaders within the Taliban that would think differently and would want to engage and would care about recognition and financial assistance. But at this point in time, they're not the ones at the top making the policies.
Oh, okay. And you just spoke about TTP, which of course is, as I said in my introduction, also is of concern to Pakistan and all the Pakistanis, because Pakistan has really faced a lot of terrorism at the hands of TTP. There were operations led. We flushed them out. We tried to, dismantle their structure. However, I feel there is no difference between Ashraf Ghani's government and the Taliban regime right now, because, the TTP resurgence within Pakistan, the attacks that are increasing across border, what difference is there? So how do you think Pakistan should deal with TTP now?
Well, yeah, Pakistan is very much in a tough spot, and we know that the talks did not work. And of course, that's not a surprise, because over many years, over a number of different governments, Pakistan has sought to conduct talks with the TTP, and they failed either because the TTP has made such crazy, ridiculous demands that Pakistan could never accept them, or the TTP actually agrees to ceasefires and lays down its arms only to renege on all of that and use those peace agreements as opportunities to rebuild and reload. And that's what's happened over the years. So that leaves the possibility of trying to restart talks, which I don't think would be in the cards at this point in time, or the possibility of kinetic operations, some type of new counterterrorism operation, perhaps not as ambitious as Zarbi Azab, of course, the one that was launched in 2014 and really finally reduced that terrible campaign of terror that Pakistan experienced for nearly a decade, but something that would focus perhaps on this renewed presence of TTP fighters on the Pakistani side of the border. And I think we can't rule out the possibility down the road of some type of counterterrorism operations that could be cross-border, because we know that the main TTP leadership continues to be in Afghanistan. Obviously, the risk of that is you could really ramp up already serious tensions between the Pakistani government, the Pakistani state, and the Taliban. But if the intensity of the attacks continues, and if the geographic spread continues to increase, then I think that'll put a lot more pressure on Pakistan. It's quite frankly, I think it's going to be one of the first big policy decisions that the new army chief will have to make, because it's the army that's going to make these calls at the end of the day. So Pakistan's not in a good place. I think it's past the point where it could just do nothing, just because this is not just a case of some isolated attacks happening in the tribal, in the northwestern parts of the country. We're seeing them happen every day, and they're happening, of course, there was the one in Islamabad, and there's reason to fear that there could be attacks in other cities. So I think that Pakistan it doesn't have the luxury of just sitting on its hands at this point.
All right. The perception in Pakistan is that as the terrorism is going to rise, I'm talking about the public perception here. US is going to mount pressure on Pakistan to deal with terrorism from Afghanistan. Do you see that happening? Because, amongst the population, people fear that, again, it's going to be do more for Pakistan, or ultimately Pakistan will have to pay the price for something that it actually faces and is not part of.
Right, and I know this is one reason why we've seen tensions between the U.S. and Pakistan, especially over the years of the war on terror, and for good reason. I can understand these tensions. I think that one thing that's been fairly consistent over the years is that despite considerable tensions and disconnects, the two militaries, and quite frankly, the two intelligence agencies in U.S. and Pakistan, they've quietly cooperated and worked and dialogued on the issue of terrorism. And even when you've had all this noise and tensions on the public front and on the civilian side, quietly, the security officials on both sides have worked together. And I imagine there have continued to be conversations. And I really don't know. And quite frankly, I think it's unlikely that we would see any type of stepped up cooperation between the US and Pakistan on the issue of countering TTP. I mean, as you said before, Islamic State Khorasan is the main terror threat for the US today, along with Al-Qaeda, or what's left of it. TTP is not what it used to be. It did previously have more global ambitions, and of course, among other things, a TTP trained fighter tried to blow up Times Square in New York some years ago. But this is a group that seems to be pretty focused on Pakistan right now. Not that that's not important and concerning for the U.S., but I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be most concerned about the group that it feels poses the most direct threat to itself, that being Islamic State. I think that the U.S., Washington will be well served in the context of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship if it does not resort to that public rhetoric that we used to hear, particularly during the Obama administration, of, Pakistan should do this, it should do that. But I think this is an administration that is focused, quite frankly, on other things. But I'd like to think that the engagements and the discussions between the U.S. and Pakistan on the issue of terrorism, counterterrorism, will be conducted privately. I think it's going to be the security officials that take up this conversation the most, for better or worse.
There's another criticism that the U.S. draws from within Pakistan, especially in context with Afghanistan, that they've dumped Afghanistan once again. And, they have no interest left, whereas the region will have to suffer what they have to suffer. And also a common Afghan. Just look at the kind of economic challenges that country is facing, the humanitarian crisis that is just looming. Do you really think that is actually the right way to say it, that they've dumped Afghanistan? Or do you think, then there is another opinion that US will never leave this region. They have a lot of interest in this region. And, this could be just, for the time being, that it is being depicted as they have no interest, whereas they have very close relations with India, and they might just turn back.
I think it's highly unlikely that the U.S. will want to turn back and return to Afghanistan, so to speak. And I mean that in a literal sense, sending troops back to Afghanistan, or strategically focusing on it as a strategically important space. I don't think either is likely. I think that President Biden was very clear and very explicit in explaining why he wanted to leave Afghanistan. His view is that the U.S. had achieved its initial goals, which were counterterrorism in nature. Now, obviously, that looks pretty bad when, as you're on your way out the door, you get hit by an Islamic State attack. But that was his position. His view, and there's strong bipartisan support for this in Washington, America's top foreign policy interest has to be U.S.-China competition. And I think that Afghanistan is not perceived as a battleground for U.S.-China competition. Contrary to many concerns in Washington and elsewhere, China has not exactly moved into Afghanistan after the U.S. departure. Neither has Russia, for that matter, or Iran, or other key rivals of the U.S. that happen to be neighbors of Afghanistan. So, and I think the war in Ukraine just made that more important. Right? The U.S. is trying to restore its alliances. It wants to work with its NATO partners. And so the Ukraine war is obviously a huge issue. And China, given how it's been acting, its increasing provocations and wolf warrior diplomacy, this is all very concerning for the U.S. And Afghanistan simply does not fit into that. Only if there's a sense or a real fear in Washington that Afghanistan is once again at risk of becoming that sanctuary for international terrorists, only then would the strategic focus return. And final point on this, given that the Taliban are sanctioned by the U.S. and the Taliban leaders have been for years, that gives the U.S. few policy options at any rate, other than focusing on how to, bring more humanitarian relief to the Afghan people and so on. So it really can't do much anyway.
And do you see in any time soon any of the countries actually recognizing the Taliban regime, or do you feel that everybody is just looking up to the US for a go-ahead, especially Pakistan? Because the way Pakistan had been pleading on how Afghans need the aid, all of the help that they could probably offer to Afghanistan, but there was no recognition from our side. And everybody felt that probably it's one of the reasons that we don't want to spoil our relations with the US by being the first one to recognize the Taliban regime.
Right. I think that Pakistan wouldn't want to be painted as that one country, one of the only countries to recognize the Taliban, as was the case in the 90s. No, I think it's unlikely that any country is going to recognize the Taliban regime anytime soon. Countries in the West, given what's happened with these social policies over the last few months, those are red lines. That's quite clear. Even when the Taliban reneged on its earlier promise to reopen schools for high school, girls back in March, that was a red line. And, I heard from U.S. officials that, that was, quite frankly, some of them were surprised when the Taliban reneged on that. I was not surprised. But that decision in of itself, I think, made it pretty much impossible that the U.S. would even contemplate recognizing the Taliban. But given what's happened over the last few weeks, even more likely. Now, I would argue that some of the countries in the neighborhood, Pakistan and some of the others, I think for them, yes, I mean, these terrible policies against women are a factor constraining recognition, but I think more the issues of security and terrorism risks loom large there that we were discussing earlier. And I can't see Pakistan or China or any of these countries recognizing the Taliban regime so long as they believe that the Taliban is not addressing their very real concerns about terrorism. Now, if the Taliban were to suddenly declare war on the TTP and curb their presence there and go after them, which they're not going to do, if they were to do that, that I think could be something that could compel Pakistan to change its mind and recognize the Taliban regime. But I just think there are too many concerns on the part of so many countries around the world, and too many cases of the Taliban not acting on the concerns, the well-founded concerns that so many countries have about the Taliban. And that's why we're not going to see any international recognition anytime soon, if at all.
Okay, Michael, I have just last 20 seconds. I just want an answer to this one. That do you feel the Taliban, lacks the ability to deal with the security challenges and rising terrorism, or is it they don't want to address it?
Well, I mean, they defeated a military that had more than 100,000 people in Afghanistan at one point. So they got the capacity. But no, I think in the case of most terror groups operating in Afghanistan, they're not interested in going after them because they're allies. And with the case of Islamic State Khorasan, which is an enemy, there the Taliban has really struggled. It's used scorched earth tactics, much like the US and the previous Afghan government did. It hasn't worked. Islamic State Khorasan, unfortunately, has learned to navigate this terrain and push back against that. So it's a combination of an inability and an incapacity, but I think, pardon me, a lack of desire and a lack of ability. But I think that it's mostly issues of simply not wanting to act against all of these different terror groups that have long been allied with the Taliban.
Well, thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, for joining us on 20 Minutes for Dawn News English. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.